when you were a younger man, you had the privilege of sitting in on some of C.S. Lewis's final lectures. And at the same time, far more recently, you have had the privilege of having a long form conversation with Dr. Peterson, which we already alluded to earlier. For me, I've been looking at the thought trajectory of C.S. Lewis and the thought trajectory of Jordan Peterson, and I see some similarities in their thinking. I'm curious if you do as well, and what maybe you can share, having this kind of unique connection point to these two thinkers. In particular, I'm thinking of Jordan Peterson has a moment in one video where he's thinking about John 1:1, and he says it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. He cries at the idea of the, quote, narrative world and the objective world touching. And I've watched that clip over a dozen times, and I'm trying to understand what is going on in that moment. What is Dr. Peterson pressing up against? And it reminds me of Lewis. But again, I don't want to infer too much myself. I just want to leave that open-ended, though, and allow you to kind of speak into these two great thinkers.
Well, I'd need to leave it open-ended too, because my hope would be that Jordan will eventually explain it to us himself. But there is something scary. The interesting thing is that what Jordan said on that occasion is a bit like C.S. Lewis's description when he felt God was following him, was chasing him, the Hound of Heaven, that kind of idea. And it may be something similar. Certainly, what is happening, if we stand back from this, I have met a number, and there are many others, of course, of very brilliant intellectuals who have begun to see the thinness and inadequacy of materialistic explanations and have moved to the position where they know that there must be something more. And then they open their minds to considering that possibly that something more may be the revelation contained in Scripture. And certainly Jordan Peterson is moving in that direction very rapidly. Witness the fact that he's prepared to engage with Scripture, letting the text stand and engaging with it both himself and with a group of people, as he did in the book of Exodus. And I found it a great honor all those years ago to listen to Lewis giving his last lectures. Unfortunately, I never met him. And similarly, to listen and interact this time with Jordan Peterson, who certainly has an incredible insight into so many things, and so many young people, particularly young men, are listening to him. And I would very much hope that what he's doing for them is to awaken what Lewis called the sense of longing, that there's something more. Let's try and find what that something more is. So that would be the situation as I understand it.
One thing on that note, and there's really just two last topics that I want to hit before we run out of time here, but it's dovetailing exactly into what you just said, that something more. And the first one is justice, and the second one is hope. So let's talk about justice first, because what I look at around me is a culture in the West that is actually obsessed with justice, social justice, making sure that there's equality, making sure that wrong is contended with and that right is rewarded. And yet my question is, ultimately, in terms of ultimate eternal justice, is it possible for that to exist without the transcendent and without God? Have you ever come across an atheistic way of resolving this huge question of justice?
Well, fundamental to your question, it's really a question of morality and right or wrong. And my short answer to your question, I don't think there is a way around it. I think that Dostoevsky was right in his book, The Brothers Karamazov, when he put into the mouth of Ivan, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. And I think what that means is not that atheists cannot behave. Of course they can. We're all moral beings. made in the image of God. It's that there's no rational justification for morality if you take the atheist view to its logical conclusion, which Richard Dawkins did in his book, The God Delusion. And that's where I think it is we read a sentence very much like the following, where he says, the universe is as exactly as you'd expect it to be if at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. It's a completely deterministic, atheistic point of view, which destroys not only justice, but the related concepts of good and evil. The irony of that is that Dawkins is prepared to protest against evil in the world. But if there's no good and no evil, that doesn't make any sense. And it seems here again to me that there's an analogous argument to the one I was making a little while ago about atheism and science not sitting very well together. Atheism and morality don't sit well together. And in fact, the famous philosopher who was an atheist, J.L. Mackie at Oxford, said that if there are absolute morals, then there's a very short distance from believing in them to the existence of God. And one can test that. It's very difficult to find anyone who believes that torturing infants is right. In other words, we are hardwired for morality. And there's evidence of that. And it's another strand. And it seems to me, if you stand back from it and ask yourself, on the basis of the New Testament, where you would expect the major evidences to lie. The Apostle Paul, at the beginning of Romans, said, well, creation's one of them, that evidences that there is a God and that he's powerful. But then the second one, he says, the existence of moral convictions in human beings. They accuse each other and they excuse each other, shows that they have built into them a concept of right and wrong. That, to my mind, is a very powerful evidence for God himself. I'm not, though, convinced that we live in a world where everybody is crying out for justice for everybody else. I think many people are screaming for justice for themselves and let the rest go hang. It seems to me that we live in a society, particularly in the West, that's far more fragmented than when I was younger, particularly in your country, but also in my own country. And it's a tragedy that moral standards have just gone absolutely to pieces. And that seems to me to be one of the reasons why people have turned away from God, even though they don't see it. That's a huge but a very important topic. And it's concepts of goodness, of rightness, of justice, and above all, of truth that need to be emphasized. But you need to take care. If you witness to the truth, you might get killed for it.